Once again, my name is Tex McLeod, and I'm the coach. I'm not the co-chair. I am the vice chair of Adams Riding Association, Saanich North and the Islands. And we're sponsoring this event to bring the community together. So we've got a variety of topics that we draw on. And tonight we are very, very pleased that Joni Olsen, Adam's sister, was able to join us. We have a chance to understand and learn about the treaties and the work that Joni's doing with the Leadership Council. Adam will explain more about what those various groups are. So what a great evening. It's been a while since we've done a Voices of Saanich, and wow, here we are kicking it off with this. And thank you, Joni and Adam, for joining us. I just want to take a moment as we get started to just reflect on this beautiful place where we live. This beautiful land, the water, the sky, the birds, the flowers. Spring is upon us, and an abundance of blossoms as spring flowers explode. And if we need to just keep this in mind, and as Adam tells us from his grandmother, it's our job to look after this place. So I'm going to welcome you. I've done that. I'm going to turn it over to Adam, and I'm going to let Adam introduce Joni. So here we go. Thank you very much for joining us.
All right. Good evening. My name is Adam Olsen. I'm the member of the Legislative Assembly for Saanich North and the Islands. Thank you for joining us this evening and this the first 2023 edition of Voices of Saanich. I'm also going to be publishing the first part of this conversation with Joni Olsen on my podcast, The Public Circle, and I look forward to this conversation. Joni is a political science student and graduate with a master's in public administration. She's the policy negotiations manager for the Saanich Leadership Council. She's my sister, and she'll do a more detailed introduction of herself, but really wanted to start this year off by having a conversation about the local relationships, Indigenous relationships in our riding in the area of Saanich North and the Islands, and the Douglas Treaties, and some of what's happening now. And so Joni and I have these conversations on an ongoing basis, a semi-regular basis, and so wanted to give the opportunity for Joni to talk about the work that she's doing. Welcome, Joni, to the conversation, to lead the conversation this evening. Basically, what we're going to do is we're going to start off with about a 45-minute presentation Joni's going to give. She's got some slides and a presentation that she's ready to give. We'll have a bit of a conversation, and then we invite you to put your questions in the Q&A. And I can see both the Q&A and the chat. However, it's hard for me to monitor both at the same time. So if you want a question to be answered and something comes up throughout, put it in the Q&A, and that's where I will be drawing the questions from for the last 30 minutes of this conversation. So at this point, I'm just going to turn it over to Joni. Nice to see you this evening, and nice to be with all of you. Joni, I'm going to throw it over to you for your introduction and for your presentation.
Okay, thank you, Adam. I'm going to share my screen. Thank you, Adam and Tex and the BC Greens for hosting this event. I have attended them before and used to actually bring snacks to them before COVID, and they could be in person. Just want to apologize. I've been sick for the last week, so just sort of making my way back into real life, and hopefully can give a good presentation this evening. So I have some slides that I'm going to work through, and the first one I'm going to do is sort of a little bit about me, so that you can really understand how, the context of how I got to the place that I'm in, and it really is sort of creates a bigger sort of picture. My name is Joni Olsen, or my traditional name is Tsewitsutia. It's actually a name that stems from Main Island. So you know, that as we move through this presentation, I'll sort of give you a glimpse into the territory also. I started as a small business owner and got married and had children, and actually had this sort of back and forth with my family of community issues, and we debate on things, and religion, and you know, politics across Canada and across the world, and was always told that if you wanted to you know, have a big opinion about something or complain about something, that you should probably go and be involved and do something about it. So I spent 14 years on the Sartlip Chief and Council. And about halfway into that 14 years, I ended up got put at tables that, like with the Department of Fisheries and with governments, as they sort of wanted to have discussions about different things with Sartlip, and found that I wasn't necessarily, it wasn't like the people across the table were really highly educated, but they were working in a system that I didn't really understand. And they would, you know, it was a lot of like, hey, let's get creative and come up with some ideas on how we can make this work together. And it was always like, well, we can't really do that, and we can't really do that. So I was like, oh, you know what? Like, I don't necessarily believe you. Like, we're being really creative here. And it was really frustrating. So at that point in time, I decided to actually stop with one of the small businesses that I had been working since I was a teenager, and go back to school. And I was an adult student with children. I wasn't going to mess around. I had my eye on the prize. I was going to go and get a degree in political science, because I figured very bluntly that if you wanted to sort of take a system out or challenge a system, you needed to know the system really well. And so and then my end goal was sort of to start the new program that had just been announced at the University of Victoria, the Indigenous Law program. So that was my sort of original goal. And I get into the political science major program, and I get a double in environmental study, minor and double minor in environmental studies and Indigenous studies, sort of lining myself up for the Indigenous Law program. And I'm at the very, very end of my degree, and I've got all my prerequisites, and I'm picking out, you know, some final classes, and, you know, I have my double minor already. So what am I going to do? And often that first sort of face that you meet across the table is a public administrator or an administrator. And so I came across this public admin 101 class and was like, that's, you know, maybe I should get to know, you know, what they're all about. And I registered for the class, and I sit through the first lecture, and the assignment that they give you is you have to write a decision note. You need to choose a problem. You need to study the problem. You need to pick the ministry that's related to the problem, and then you need to, you know, write some background on it, some discussion on it, and you need to provide them with some options, some opinions, different opinions, and some options. And I was like, where has this been my whole entire schooling, right? So you can take, you know, 4 or 5 years of political science and not really ever get to know how those decisions are actually made. For the most part, it's on, you know, political will and whether somebody's going to get voted in again. But they have these teams of policy writers and researchers that sort of back the decisions that are made. And at that very moment in time, I decided that I was not going to go into Indigenous law, and that there was lots of Indigenous people going into Indigenous law. And that I needed to go into public admin. And so over COVID, I spent 2 years while working, doing the Master's in Public Admin program at the University of Victoria, and I graduated about a year ago. My job also likes me to have some additional training wherever they can support me with additional training. And so I went in and got a certificate in effective negotiation skills, because often in Indigenous organizations, you start in any kind of discussion or negotiation, at a deficit. You don't go in with anything, and that is the most difficult position to be in when negotiating. So they wanted us to sort of work through some of those challenges. And then I originally got hired at the Saanich Leadership Council as a CRD liaison. Then several months later, moved up to the policy negotiations analyst. And then when my boss or manager went to work for the province of British Columbia, I got moved into the management position. And it was just shortly after I had my master's degree given to me. I'm also a descendant of the Saanich people, and I am a registered member of the Sartlip community. So I have, this sort of, I was born and raised in the Sartlip community, and have had an eye on sort of, the issues and the politics throughout my life, but also cross over sort of that border onto the other side, as my mom is of English German descent, and and live in a very sort of mixed society. And so, often sort of straddled this place of, between two spaces where I really felt like I could play a role in, bringing those two places together. So that's a little bit about myself. I just want to thank you for joining us this evening. Throughout this presentation, I'm going to provide you with a little bit of information on the Saanich First Nation and our territory. I'm going to do a quick overview of the 1852 Douglas Treaty, and then discuss some of the cumulative impacts that have happened to the territory and some of the challenges that provides, and some of the different ways that we look at that. And then I'm going to finish with some of the work that I do at the WLC, which is the Saanich Leadership Council. The Saanich territory was a really thriving place. And sometimes it's really hard to sort of see that and visualize that. And so I'm actually going to switch, stop sharing this screen, and I'm actually going to share another screen with you just briefly here. Oh, sorry about that. There we go. So this is how we normally see the place in which we live. And maps can show us quite a lot of where we live and sort of who belongs there. So we see everything sort of labeled in the way that we like to see things labeled. And this is a tool that actually I give credit to Justin Fritz. He was a coworker of mine, and this is this is not a public map. So I share it as it's one of the tools that we use at the Saanich Leadership Council. And I use it to demonstrate where the Saanich, like we have a problem with sort of putting a border and a circle around our territory. And so how do we explain sort of where our territory is? And one of the ways that we've done this is through Sinchothan place names. So where a language is commonly shared, often will sort of signify where that territory is. So I'm actually going to, you can kind of see as I move down here, there's a legend, and Justin did a ton of work in mapping out lots of different places. He came originally to the Sartlip community and asked if he could map out our reef net fishery. And our chief and council at that time said, yeah, and why don't you map out all of these other things too? Because one of our problems is in sort of this lack of proof, I suppose, is what like historically governments would have looked for and still a bit today. So he starts sort of mapping out this, and he comes up with this just fantastic tool. And what I'm really going to do with this map today, just to give you just a demonstration of where we see ourselves as Saanich, is just bringing up the Sinchothan place names. And so you can see the territory, and actually there are some Chothan place names that go up the, up the Fraser River also, down into the United States. My grandfather was born in Friday Harbor in the United States. So this international border often creates a little bit of a challenge for us, or quite a lot of a challenge. And you can kind of see where the Saanich people territory is. And Justin did a really good job, because if you click on these places, you can actually come up with sort of where he got the piece of information from, possibly what the name means, and a little bit more information about the place. So this is a fantastic tool. And I really like to use it as a demonstration. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to go back. So the Saanich territory was pretty vast. There was a lot of strategic relationships that were built within the territory for times of war, and protecting territory and resources and the people. There was a lot of trade that happened. It was sort of impossible for the Saanich people to harvest all the goods that they needed to use locally. So there was a lot of, like, for instance, the weaving with goat's hair was one of the sort of valued possessions that they had. So they would go into the Fraser Valley and they would trade for goat's hair, often things like dried clams, things that you couldn't get in the Fraser Valley. And then for other plants and species. So there was a lot of travel and a lot of trade. And it created a really, really valuable economy. Kinship relations, often through marriage, creating allies and access to these different resources. And then with a Saanich law, and that's one of the things that we actually look at the Leadership Council is, what are the Saanich laws, and what was that sort of based on, and the beliefs that they were related to, and how can we utilize them in the work that we do today. Often those belief systems were that the other species were sort of the transformation from human into different species. And it created these other things, other beings within our territory as our relatives. And the lesson is sort of, you treat them as such. If you take care of them, then they will take care of you. And I think we lose some of that in today's society, but historically, if you weren't sort of in a position where you really respected those relationships, you had very limited access to resources. So that reciprocal relationship was really, really important to your survival at times, or how you thrived within a society. And so it really sort of ran deep. And I think that the reef net story that I like to use, and conservation, is a good sort of reference point for that. So in the reef net, which is a technology that is used today, except without the hole in it, was a technology that Gales, the creator, had given to the Saanich people. And it was two canoes that sat side by side, and a large net that followed a reef down into the water that were anchored there. And those places often belonged to families. So when we talk about sort of not ownership of things, there was definite sort of ownership of especially harvesting places. So in the net itself, there was a hole, so that the largest salmon and the head of the salmon family, when caught up in the reef net, could swim through and go back and spawn to bring on another generation of salmon. Then the whole fishing, reef net fishing, would stop, and there would be a first salmon ceremony that would take time, giving more salmon time to move through and go up the river for spawning. And this actually is us, this was us taking care of the salmon. This is conservation, but this is us taking care of the salmon so that they will come back and feed us in the following years. In the modern net, like often when we're like, where did the salmon go? Saanich people are like, well, you know, we actually broke that law. We actually broke that relationship that we have with those the families of salmon. So why would they come back? Because we've basically taken them completely out of the water without any kind of way for them to go back up and spawn. So no hole in the net, no fish. So it was those types of relationships where you are sort of giving back was deeply embedded into Saanich belief systems and law. And they had sort of a reverence and respect for their relatives around them. And so would treat different species or even the islands with that respect, so that they would then be taken care of. So there was a really deep belief and a deep belief in that today. Saanich had tremendous skills and knowledge that came from thousands of years of experience, knowing harvesting sites, preserving methods, and building techniques that brought them through the toughest of West Coast conditions. The Saanich people and surrounding sort of First Nations had housing technology, and you can kind of see this cedar slat sort of house in the picture that you're looking at. This picture actually was a watercolor painting done in 1913 in the Paquachin First Nation. And, you know, like they weren't chopping down trees and milling it. There was, you know, they were taking trees very slowly and creating slat boards through, you know, creating the big planks of boards even while the trees were still standing. So the types of skills and knowledge that the Saanich people had for building and medicines and even their kinship relationships and diplomatic relationships created a really fantastic community and place to live for hundreds and hundreds of years. So in the 1840s, there became a little bit more settlers into Victoria, and there was a desire to build Fort Victoria. So before that, there were people who, you know, would come to the territory and missionaries and such, or just travelers. And but really in 1847 was the creation of Fort Victoria. And so a few hundred settlers came in, and James Douglas with HBC, the Hudson's Bay Company, and started building Fort Victoria. And in 1852, there became the North and South Saanich Douglas Treaty. And I want to give you a little bit of context for the Douglas Treaty. So with all the newcomers coming to the area, the Saanich actually, you know, being traders and of goods, use this new settlement for trade, but we're not nearly as open to the idea of settlers as sort of our other neighbors were. Fort Victoria was growing, and a mill was set up in Cadborough Bay, sort of Cordova Bay, Cadborough Bay area, for the ease of harvesting wood in the area. Cordova Bay to Mount Doug had particularly straight trees that were good for masting ships that were of interest. So Douglas's men were logging a great number of trees in this area and creating destruction and burn piles that the Saanich were not happy with. So there was sort of this cultural difference in ways of harvesting, and that, you know, created some conflict there. Then there was a teenage boy from Cowichan that was carrying a message through the area. He was taking a commonly used trail that had a new fence built in its path, and after jumping this fence, he was shot. This was enough for the Saanich people. They gathered and decided that they were going to evict Douglas's men from the area, got in several large canoes and paddled to the shores of the logging site and told Douglas's men that they were not that they were not welcome there anymore. Douglas gets word of this and calls a meeting with Saanich at the top of Pacoles. And because we only have 45 minutes today, I'm moving quite quickly through each of these topics, which could go into great depth, but just giving an overview. So he calls a meeting with the Saanich people at the top of Pacoles, which is Mount Doug. And just as other considerations that were sort of happening at the same time, there was the Cayuse Wars that were sort of from 1847 to 1855 in the northern states, where there was a lot of loss and it was very expensive. And here in Victoria, the settlers were greatly outnumbered. So at that point in time, you know, there's different sort of records saying that there was, you know, between 20 and 30,000 Indigenous people on sort of this, you know, Nanaimo South, and that there was under 10,000 or under 1,000 in Fort Victoria, sorry, at that point in time. So often we think sort of we're signing treaties because we feel threatened of some sort and or a threat of some sort. Well, in this case, the Saanich people did not feel threatened and did not sign a treaty because there was a threat of some sort. They were at this point in time sort of flexing a little bit, saying we've had enough, you now need to leave. And so you see sort of James Douglas writes Sir Archibald Barclay, representative of the Queen, to let him know that the Saanich people were not happy and that something needed to be done, but that war was expensive and, you know, nobody had money. You know, nobody had money for a treaty, nobody had money for war, so we've got to sort of figure this out. Barclay writes back and says the same thing. The Queen does not have money to create a treaty with the Saanich, and you know, she had just settled the rest of Canada, and you know, wasn't sort of moving into BC in the same way. And Douglas writes and requests a copy of the Treaty of Waitangi, so the treaty that they had signed in New Zealand. Saanich has a plan. You can see on my screen, there's two versions of the Douglas Treaty, but the context, there would be two versions of too. And there's a written version of the Douglas Treaties, the 1852 North and South Saanich Douglas Treaties, and then there's an oral version of the Douglas Treaty, which actually the people, when discussing afterwards, called Douglas's Word. So I'll get to that in a second. So Saanich had planned to kill Douglas and his men at this meeting. They bring many men to this gathering. Douglas brings blankets and a small amount of money, and he's sort of looking for peace. He really wants, you know, to be able to settle in Fort Victoria without, you know, without any trouble. That's where he wants to be. Douglas uses a missionary to translate. Missionaries were familiar to the Saanich people. A belief in God was something that the Saanich people could relate with. They revered the creator and respected the belief in God. So, you know, the whole sort of foundation of the Saanich history in the place, like even that relationship with other species, was one that, you know, was set by the creator. The creator transformed humans into other species if they weren't sort of you know, through certain behaviors. And so there was this deep respect and kind of an understanding of sort of that relationship with that sort of greater being. At this event, attendance was taken and was signed, and I'll sort of air quote that, with a cross-like symbol, that some people think that all the X's were done by the same hand. So there's even conflict in what happened that day. And you can kind of see what I have up on my screen. You can kind of be the judge of it yourself, you know, whether that was done with one hand or two, but there's definitely been studies on it that that have come back that it was possibly done with all the same hand. The Saanich went up and, you know, sort of with this translator, backed off a little bit and was really looking for, needed an apology. They had been wronged. And, in the Saanich culture, blankets can be seen as an item for trade, but also they have much higher significance for things like relationship building. So, they often came with when we're creating relationships with other people and sort of building kinship ties. And so, the idea that it was a blankets for a sale of land with so many sort of different sort of cultural and language barriers was not something that was really clear that day. Douglas looks over the peninsula. So this is in the oral version of the story. Douglas looks over the peninsula and sort of points his hand over the land and says, we want to live sort of in peace in Fort Victoria, and you can live here the same way you've always done. The treaty is obviously like a really contentious topic, with language barriers and cultural differences. But one thing is that, in my mind, as we've sort of moved through these discussions over the years, is you do not create a treaty that transfers ownership of land with another party unless you recognize that other party as an owner of the land, right? Like you wouldn't even bother coming to the table for that. And the other thing is that, the ownership of land is really, like how they saw Indigenous people as owners of land was quite different because they thought that if a piece of land looked untouched, that it wasn't used or cared for or managed, which wasn't true for the Saanich people also. The Douglas Treaty has been used as a tool in the court system, and has won on several occasions, and we'll sort of get through that as I sort of move through. But it also has never been implemented properly. So it's a simple treaty. It doesn't have a lot of content or text to it. And so that it has never been sort of taken very seriously. After the treaty was made in 1852, and the land was supposed to be surveyed sort of shortly thereafter, not until sort of the 60s did Pemberton and Trutch come in and survey the land. James Douglas moved on. And so settlers started taking up the land out on the peninsula. Saanich becomes somewhat of a farming community. The Indian Act in 1876, residential schools, an assault on language and culture and children, an intentional assault on governance and social structures. It becomes illegal to hunt. The reef net fishery becomes illegal. The reserves are made and a pass system is created. And just that lack of movement creates a lack of access to food and supplies, equals starvation and poverty. Federal management of reserve lands and the creation of an on-reserve social housing program, isolation, racism, and discrimination. It was illegal to raise the funds to hire a lawyer. Saanich reserves were made into individual First Nations and with separate administrations and chiefing councils, and completely removed from their connection to the land, their culture, knowledge, and ways of being. So this is like a really sort of compact, the treaty, and then this sort of like overwhelming change in just the way their entire life structure was. And so it's sort of like, how do you implement a treaty when you're just constantly feeling these assaults one after another? So what does treaty implementation mean then? How in this setting do the Saanich people meaningfully practice their culture and rights when it's just constantly being taken away? And I sort of add a little bit of a blurb from the treaty itself. So village sites and enclosed fields were to be kept for our own use, for the use of our children and for those who may follow after us, and land shall be properly surveyed hereafter. It is also understood that we are at the liberty to hunt over unoccupied lands and carry out our fisheries as formerly. So to the Saanich people, hunting on unoccupied lands and carrying out our fisheries as formerly would just be like how we did them formerly, not, you know, not necessarily with the BC government and the federal government regulatory system, determining how it's done. How do you hunt and fish as formerly where all of the unoccupied lands? What does treaty implementation mean for those of us who do not hunt and fish? What about the management of our territory? This was an essential element of, you know, to hunt and to fish, was the management of those spaces. And what about other harvesting, trees and medicine, watershed and wetland foods and other resources? And like I said, is it to hunt using Saanich laws and not BC hunting guidelines and regulations, or is it to fish with Saanich laws without having to follow DFO regulation and laws? These things have put us in court several times. They've had our elders pepper sprayed, confiscated tools, freezers raided, you know, out in the, you know, the general public, you know, the scrutiny. So we don't fit into the system, and that's fine. I don't think Saanich people really want to fit into the system. However, because the system is not flexible, if we are not to change the system, then we leave sort of it up to the courts and individuals to do so. This is expensive and uncertain and leaves the job to the children of the Saanich people for the future, which is one of the other reasons why I've gotten into this line of work. Another sort of example of the reef, I'll bring the reef net fishery back into here because just to provide a clear example of how sort of government policy does not really work with it, is it's illegal for the Saanich people to fish commercially without a DFO license, that is, because it's with a net, and commercial fishing is defined as fishing with a net. But we can fish for food and ceremonial as formerly, but not with a net. Because if we fish with, but we did fish with a net historically. So it's like this bad policy circle, really, is what it is. And DFO is one of the toughest nuts to crack. So I think that one's a ways away from being resolved. Is it stopping further development so that these practices have a place that they can occur, such as the Saanich Bay Marina case, where the Sayout community challenged a license for a marina in the Saanich Bay and won, and it was found that it was not just the act of fishing that was within the right, but the Saanich people can protect the place in which we do these things, because without a place, there would be no meaningful place to do it. So that was a court case that was won in the 80s. And, you know, that sort of starts building out to what it was to fish as formerly. So it wasn't just the act of fishing. Now it was the actual protection of the places to fish. It may be a little late for some of this, especially with hunting, to hunt as formerly. But if we do not look at ways of making space for these things, what will it look like in another 170 years? And this is another reason why I went and got the education that I did, and why I worked for the Leadership Council. If we talk about these things, I just want to make a note, actually, that we talk about these things as rights, but historically they were responsibilities. And this is what my brother often talks about also. And it's what I like to focus on, actually. Within Saanich laws, we were given the responsibility. It was the right of the Samayeth, the deer. It was the right of the deer to have a healthy habitat to live in. That's a Saanich law. Therefore, it was the responsibility of the people to assure that this happened. We weren't to mess up the habitat of the deer. That was against the law. If the Samayeth do not have a healthy, sustainable habitat, then we have broken the Saanich law. And so today, many people have broken Saanich law because there's no places for the Samayeth in our territory anymore. Cumulative impacts, and that leads nicely into this slide. Cumulative impacts are at the core of so many of our discussions that we have for treaty implementation discussions and in our daily work in our referrals department. And just so that you know, our referrals departments are departments that process projects that must go through the legal duty to consult. So you can see that I have just selected 2 views of territory, and you can just see that the urban sprawl has left very little of our territory for any room for really anything. And then on the left of the screen, I actually have beach closures. So this is what shellfish harvesting map looks like in our territory. So you can see that the reasons for closures here: biotoxins, sanitary closures, chemical closures, industrial and municipal treatment, sewage treatment, marinas, ferry wharves, living floats or fish fin nets make it so that it's literally impossible to really find or feel safe harvesting off of the beaches. And the Saanich people, being people of of the sea, have a saying that when the tide is out, the table is set. So there's conflict. There's conflict here, and this is one of the most popular topics that comes across my table at the Leadership Council, and I'll touch on it a little bit when I start on that work, because there's a couple of meetings that we've been in around food security that are relevant to that. At the beginning of our meetings with the government, we asked the government to bring in a map of Crown land that might be available so that we can discuss sort of land back opportunities for treaty implementation or reparation for loss. So this is kind of the beginning of a process, right? So we're sort of looking at, where can we do these things? How do we create a sustainable self-determining nation without resources? So we're looking at sort of, okay, where can we gather some of these resources? Yeah, because not all of the discussions are regarding rights implementation. Some of them have to do with the creation of self-determination with economic resources. So the government brings in a map into the table and rolls it out onto the desk, onto the table, and says, there's the observatory, the Center for Plant Health, over by the panorama, the Institute for Ocean Sciences, the D&D property, the firing range, parks, the airport, and a few BC hydro boxes. Everywhere else was fee simple or local government land. The beaches are closed to harvesting due to pollution, and open fields belong to farmers. The environment in which we live is complex, with several layers of government jurisdiction, shared First Nation territories, and very few resources, and so many competing needs. In 2021, the Blueberry First Nation brought BC to court for cumulative impacts case. It was called the Yahi case. This precedent-setting case was won by the Blueberry First Nation, and it was not challenged by the government of BC. The court actually found that, and one of the most popular sort of sayings coming out of this court case was a death by 1,000 cuts. So due to the cumulative impacts of the industrial development on Blueberry First Nations treaty rights, the province had breached its treaty obligation to Blueberry First Nation. The province has taken up lands to such an extent that there are not sufficient and appropriate lands to allow the Blueberry First Nation to meaningfully exercise their treaty rights, therefore unjustifiably infringing on the Blueberry First Nation treaty rights. The court also granted the following relief. The province may not continue to authorize activities that breach the treaty promises. The parties must act with diligence to consult, to negotiate, and to establish timely enforceable mechanisms to assess and manage the cumulative impacts of industrial development. And then they designated $35 million for the Blueberry First Nations to heal the land, and $35 million for them to protect their Indigenous way of life. There is a lot of similarities between the Blueberry and the Saanich, including the language in the treaty. I would argue that as a Saanich person, we have more cumulative impacts than the blueberry did. We have very few places left to harvest that are not polluted or that leave the Saanich people exposed to harassment. And we have projects going through, like SARTLEP is doing a loss of use project and mapping so that we can demonstrate this. We are dealing with conflicting policies such as the fishing with a net and with multiple layers of complexity. We also have new projects that are going through daily. This process has many problems. The lack of information or large amounts of information with unrealistic timelines. Often projects are completely planned out and priced out before consultation and don't have room to make changes. They're often posed as the only option benefiting the general population. They often meet provincial standards, where we often say it's great to meet provincial standards, but have we not got to the point we are today by meeting provincial standards? Whose standards? Like who is creating these standards? They're not Saanich standards. Where are Saanich laws and principles and values in these standards? So we have, started to sort of try to define what cumulative effects are, creating a data set for these cumulative effects, having the Environmental Assessment Act not just review on a project by project basis, which is a problem. And cumulative effects should be defined and be tangible and relevant to the needs of impacted First Nations communities. Holistic perspectives combined with Western sciences is sort of where we're going with it. Building usable baselines and cumulative effects data to fill in the gaps of information and policy and the regulatory process, and overlaying an Indigenous perspective or Saanich perspective, history and priorities, and traditional knowledge to define cumulative effects and how that data is scoped. I'm going to quickly go through a little bit of what we do at the Saanich Leadership Council. So it was a table that was created by several Saanich leaders that came together that were actually talking about Parks Canada, so the GINPR. I just wanted to actually say governments don't actually negotiate with First Nations out of the goodness of their heart. They negotiate because we keep winning in court and they have the legal obligation through treaties. They're also looking to sort of solve their Indian problem. So the administration of First Nations they're aiming to create self-governing nations so they can sort of get out of that business per se. Although some First Nations are working on this through treaty negotiations, the Saanich nations have been opposed to this because the only option was to do so through the modern day treaty process that the Saanich never wanted to take part in because they saw it as an extinguishment policy. In 2018, Carolyn Bennett and Joe Wild traveled to BC and introduced the Recognition of Indigenous Rights and Self-Determination table, otherwise known as the RIRSD table. This was supposed to be a new way of doing things. SARTLEP took up the offer, and then through the parks discussions with the other leadership, a collaborative RIRSD table and the WLC was initiated. The WLC was a collaborative table for all of the Saanich leaders and community members to come together and contribute to how and where they would like to see change. For Saanich to talk about Saanich nationhood and territory and create one voice for moving forward. And they do these government conversations through a federal LOU and a BC LOU, where we've created sort of priority topics for discussions to sort of start getting the ball rolling. But local governments and non-governmental organizations have started come to us for things like OCP or policy review to see how they can start doing things better. And this was sort of one area where I was going to bring up very quickly because I can see I would like to have some discussion with Adam. Is in central, I live in central Saanich. Central Saanich is a big agricultural food security. They like to keep their land, agricultural land. to promote food security. And they're going through their official community plan, and we're in a meeting and they're like, just promoting food security. Like what we're looking to do is like nurture the land so that we can have food security. And who can disagree with that? In fact, if you'd like to donate money today, the donation of my choice is actually the local food bank. Food security is incredibly important, but often the agricultural runoff from farms actually pollutes beaches and makes them unharvestable. And this was one of sort of the key points in the discussions that we had with Central Saanich. Your food security does not consider this other food security, with Saanich food security, which is a lot of harvesting off of beaches. So there's sort of those policy conflicts or conflicts in different sort of cultural sort of belief systems. So local governments, CRD, Islands Trust, all start sort of calling. And the capacity and like band administrations were built for community management. And often are trying to create the capacity for dealing with so many of these things. So the WLC for the communities that we work with will do OCP reviews and give sort of, work with community members, and we have community committees that we work with. Actually a whole lot of them, where they come in and they'll help do the review, and then we'll provide feedback both to the community and to Central Saanich. What we have realized is that this level of government, the local level of government, has had just as much, maybe even more impact on our territory. They're making decisions on watersheds and development and urban sprawl that is our death by 1,000 cuts. Changing policies to better reflect our values, to better protect the land that is left is a good start. Advocacy for land for the Saanich, creating space for cultural practice and education, housing and business. This is the only way that we're going to become self-sustaining and self-determining. Changing government structures so that we are actively and meaningfully taking part in decision-making, and applying Saanich laws, principles, and values to decision-making, and seeing reparation for loss that what the Saanich people have suffered. I sped it up there in the end, started off slow. I've been sick. My apologies for that. Maybe stumbled through my first few slides, but I'm going to have a discussion with Adam and maybe fill in some of those blanks. Thanks.
Thank you, Joni. Thank you. That was, well, I'll just speak for myself. That was a great run through, and some of the stuff that you said I'd never heard before. So that was good. Very, very thorough walk through our history. I guess the question that I have for you in this is, when we're looking at that map and we're looking at the reality of the cumulative impacts, where is your thinking that we're going here in the next 10 years? Do you have a picture of what that looks like, or an idea? Has there been those discussions?
No. I mean, I have in my mind, as a counselor for the Sartla First Nation, we started looking at the Roberts Bank Terminal 2 expansion project over in Vancouver, or right beside Tsawwassen. And we're looking at expanding. One of our biggest crises in Victoria right now is the housing, right? I mean, I'm a CBC listener. We need more housing. And with Saanich people, we need more housing too, right? So, but that's not really the housing that everybody's talking about, really. But at the same time, it's like, and especially with the Salish Sea, now to sort of jump from one thing to the other, what is the carrying capacity of these places? What is an amount of building or development that we can do that actually is truly sustainable for the environment? So how do we find that without really redefining or looking at cumulative impacts? And right now, the government is doing a cumulative impacts sort of assessment. And I've sat in a lot of those meetings, but they find cumulative impacts really difficult, a thing to study. And so I think that we're kind of at the beginning of it, even down here in the Saanich Inlet, right? We've asked for, let's look at the pollutants coming into the Saanich Inlet so we can possibly harvest for clams. And the other organizations that are sort of doing those partnerships to do that work are like, let's sort of move down a little bit closer to Pockwitchin because Saanich is too complex. There's too many different pollutants going in there. How we'll never be able to sort out sort of like the issues in Saanich Inlet, but we can trace back from a less complex area and maybe find a leaky septic field and fix that problem. And then this beach can open down here. So we want to solve some of the more easier sort of problems, but not some of the more complex problems. And Saanich Inlet being one of them. So with something like the National Marine Conservation Area Reserve, which is another area that actually 11 First Nations up and down the island from here to Nanaimo are looking at, it's like, we want to conserve this National Marine Conservation Area, this big, nice area, except not, and the First Nations call it the Swiss cheese model, but not this area and not this area and not this area and not this area and not this area. Those areas are too polluted. We don't even want to kind of start there. And often they are human pollution. So it's not that we can't prevent it. It's that they're just not as easy to.
Yeah, so I think I've talked about this in other provincial ministries like forestry, for example. It's a level of kind of environmental racism, but unless you are on the receiving end of having your berry patches and your clam digging beds and the places where you got your food from removed because of logging or because of, as you were pointing out, septic fields, right? We've got part of the challenge is going around and telling every single one of those landowners that has a septic field that their septic field is leaking and it's polluting somebody's clam gardens over there, right? And so the government makes the decision that it's easier to shut the clam garden down than it is to have the conversation about the environmental pollution. And when we're standing on the island just off of Salt Spring, that's exactly the conversation that we were at Russell Island. It's exactly the conversation that we were having.
With Saanich law is like, from the work that I've really looked at, is on really setting a regulation in place for human behavior that allows the environment to be the environment that a healthy environment, right? And I mean, that's what our policies and regulations are for in Western law for the most part too. But I don't think that they go far enough. We're not, the standards in which the province have set are not high enough in order to prevent cumulative impacts on the environment. And the environment is really what that intimate relationship with the environment was survival for the Saanich people historically. And because we have all these other systems today, we don't see it as survival, but it is still survival of human beings, is the health of the earth and the health of life. And that is, when we sit around the table and do talk, like you said, for urban sprawl, a lot of people around our committees tables just say, enough is enough, no more, stop it. Well, right? So how do you resolve that with the need for more housing all the time, just more and more and more housing? So I've actually sat around our table several times, like, what is our end goal? What is our vision? Like, for our beautiful Salish Sea, and no offense to Hong Kong, but is it Hong Kong? Like, is that where we're going? Because without a plan, without a strategic plan in our mind, that's where we will end up. That's where we'll end up. So First Nations are drawing that back. They're not saying none.
In context of the density, like just highly dense. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Because you can't say no to international shipping because it's, you can't say no to the growth of Heartland landfill or the highway by Goldstream. How do you say no to things that are being put into place for the benefit of the general public when you're a small First Nation, right? We've always, like I said, we're always at a deficit. We're in that negotiation because we're not the general public. So,
but yet there's this, and then this is the conflict in this, and that is that because of the history that you've outlined around land and those relationships that they framing in this at the very beginning of your presentation around the central question about land and how all of this we see today has been achieved, there is a reconciliation that is required in this, and that you land at the outcome of the Blueberry River case with a cumulative impact, because there is an accounting that needs to be taken on the commitments that were made and then the outcomes that were just basically, as you pointed out, through the early 20th century, mostly the 20th century, with the Indian Act in its worst form, what that did and the impacts that had. Until your presentation, it didn't click for me that one of the things about this provincial government wanting to approve LNG in this province so much was that they decided not to appeal the Blueberry case to the Supreme Court, because the ruling, as you pointed out, said you have to stop. You can't approve anything more up here until this gets sorted out. And it was a quicker route to not appeal it and put together this package, and also open a much bigger question about the cumulative impacts that you've been talking about. That to me, I knew all of the information, but I had never organized it that way. And it is one of the outcomes of this government wanting to move LNG so much, is that now Saanich is having this conversation about cumulative impacts like you've never had.
We actually met with Semiahmoo First Nation about maybe 3 weeks ago, and Semiahmoo First Nation are close relatives of the Saanich people. They're over on the mainland, and they have that same sort of cross border with Northern Washington First Nations. And they're doing a really interesting project on cumulative impacts. And sitting and listening to their presentation, I was like, oh, wait, that's us too. Like, we're constantly questioning those standards, and like, let's not maybe stop projects, but let's back it up a little bit and do things a little bit better. Why not do that? Why not apply a little bit higher standard to the way that we have the environment for something like a new sewage outfall, right? So that has potential to add cumulative impacts to Saanich Inlet and to all of the clam bed harvesting on Salt Spring Island. Let's draw that back a little bit, and let's say, why are we not setting it through like creating a system like Victoria did, where you have a higher level of tertiary treatment? Why aren't we looking into the future on things like that? So that's really what we challenge the government with around our table.
All right, I'm going to go to a question here. There was a question from David, because I think that there is people that live in this area are going to ask the question, how does this impact people that are currently living in the area? And that's the spirit of David's question here, talking about quoting Chief David Lattès, and basically coming to the question, what are the implications today for landowners in Brentwood Bay?
What are the implications for landowners in Brentwood Bay? Well, fee simple property is not something the government wants to talk about with us, because you're the voters. And if they put your private property at risk, then they probably won't be getting voted in next time. Let's be real. So fee simple property owners in Brentwood Bay are, for the most part, pretty safe because of that. But at the same time, like I am in high school, I had one of my best friends' dads that was like, I'm going to lock my doors so that those, excuse my language, but Indians don't come take my property. And he's like literally across the street. Like that was going to happen. Like that's not going to happen either. So there's like these, I was like that's ridiculous sounding. Implications for people living in Brentwood Bay. Maybe eventually when we get to Central Saanich, might be some watershed initiatives on keeping the watershed nice and clean so that we can clean up our beaches. We're looking at Heartland Landfill and their pollutants so that they, can maybe clean up their act with pollutants. The big dream I think of myself and a couple of my colleagues would be, when we look at somebody like somewhere like Blueberry and they've got an oil market in their territory of forestry. When they look at creating these reconciliation packages with the government, they look at being part of these industries to create an economy for themselves so that they can become self-sustaining nations. And when we meet with the government, like I said in my presentation, there isn't anything. There's very little around here, except for what? Except for $1 million houses everywhere, real estate everywhere. So maybe it's not your house, and maybe that's not it. But maybe what it is every single time a house is sold, there's a property transfer tax. And the idea is that we never sold this land and that we have that underlying jurisdiction, and that maybe part of that should create sustainability for our nations because there isn't much more. But that conversation with the government is quite an advanced conversation. And they have to wrap their head around it a little bit further, but it is one that we've brought up. But I mean, other implications would be, us sort of pressuring municipalities to do better environmentally. I think that's probably the biggest one.
Well, I can tell you, I've talked to at least 2 ministers of Indigenous relations, 2 ministers of finance about the idea that you raised. I mean, the reality is that the provincial government has a system where they collect a property transfer tax. And, when I take a look at the relationships, the fiscal relationships that nations around the province are getting, it is in connection to resource extraction. And as you've outlined in this history, there is very, very few resources to extract anymore. We are now at a situation of the resources that are being extracted are exactly that, wealth from the transfer of property. And it is because the question is a land question, and we have a land tax, and the way that and we have a government that agrees that their sovereignty with nations and rights and title. Those words are words that our premier says. Yeah, and believes. And so, I think that the idea, David's question about how does this impact, I actually don't think it's in a negative way. I think actually the reality of it is with the Saanich people generating revenue, sustainable revenue each year, then they can be meaningful contributors to ensure that the watersheds are clean, to ensure that the beaches are cleaned up, and to have those teachings at the core of how we govern this area is not a bad idea. If you think about it, those clam beds, when they're dead, it's a reflection of the place that we live. Mm-hmm. Why wouldn't we want those clam beds to be vibrant and producing like they did for our ancestors who, we come from a wool workers, and you are a wool worker. I'm terrible, but, I'm a good salesman, I guess. No, but we got that wool. Our family got that wool because we dried clams and we traded them up into, and it was a robust trade. And there's a lot of clams and a lot of wool and a lot of blankets. And so, I think to be able to extract resources from what is here now, it has to be part of the conversation and not a scary one. In fact, I think that it makes the whole place a more interesting, more diverse, more incredible place to be, actually, if and when Saanich are part of that decision making. Sorry.
Yeah.
Let's go to another question. That was my rant. I'll try not to do that anymore. How was the property previously known as Woodwind Farm obtained? Was it money provided through reparation? What is the process of that you can talk about? I don't know how much of it was in camera or what, but
we actually, that was the beginning of sort of our RIRSD discussions, but outside of that, really, like we were talking RIRSD with the federal government, but applying pressure, like we didn't have a provincial table really at that point in time, applying pressure to the province because before the property was sold to the housing initiative, Sarlip was looking for first right of refusal to purchase. And that didn't happen. It kind of just was sold. And then there was wanting this sort of housing development for the Homelessness Society. And we approached the owner and said, hey, like, you know, we actually believe this is our land. You want to like maybe partner, you know, like maybe addition to reserve and we can make some housing, you know, like, because, you know, you can remove it from the land use system from the municipality. Anyway, there wasn't a desire to create a relationship with the First Nation, and there wasn't an avenue to create houses there. And so we kept on pushing the provincial government for it. We're not part of the treaty process. It was not part of a treaty settlement. BC Housing actually owned the land, which I think was a big mistake for them to purchase, and they were regretting it because the ALC was just not going to move, and I don't think was getting support from Central Saanich for doing that also. And so I think just because we had pushed so hard, it's directly adjacent to our nation, that land came back sort of in a year-end push. There was a couple of us on council that pushed hard for that piece of property. And there's no more magic to it than that, really. Now, when we talk about that, how that happened with the BC government that we are in conversations with, they're a little bit perplexed by it also, to be honest. So it was a move by BC Housing, and I think it's because they realized they probably couldn't put housing on there.
Well, BC Housing bought. So what happened on the BC Housing side of it, from what I remember, was that they Judy Darcy was the minister responsible for mental health and addiction at the time, and they bought it because they were intrigued by the working farm idea that was there, and they were going to do their own intentional community potentially. And so when the land went for sale, they purchased it because they got it, I think, for a fairly good deal in what was going on. And they never pushed forward on that project. And so I think in the end, I think you're right. They ended up feeling like we own a piece of farmland that we can't develop with housing the way we traditionally do. And mental health and addictions isn't doing these farms. So, or they weren't. So I think that is kind of where it landed. Can you talk a little bit about the Tamach treaty that's across the way and the relationships the complexities of that, or maybe the simplicity of it? I'm not sure.
You know, the government has actually changed a lot of their modern day treaty policy just in the last couple of
yesterday
years.
Actually.
So some of these treaty negotiations might start moving a little bit faster because they have, instead of sort of these final agreements, they're now sort of relationship building agreements that can be amended.
We amended Tsawwassen treaty yesterday, removing the restriction on Section 87 tax exemptions. So
you no
that's
longer
happening.
have to repay huge negotiation debt. There's like 4 or 5 sort of pretty main aspects to that'll actually encourage them to keep on going. So like 40 years of treaty negotiation, you've got Haida and Tsawwassen and maybe like less than a handful of others in BC. And so they've really like taken like, here's what we think they started with a whole bunch of other First Nations that just dropped out and were like, we're out. This is just not a good deal for us. And So they've been encouraged to change their process a little bit. We did have discussions with Malahat, because Malahat traditionally was named as one of the Saanich nations or communities, and we had concerns, like with you being Douglas Treaty. And sort of negotiating a new treaty, what happens to that Douglas Treaty? And we didn't like, they have a right to self-determine, the way that they would like to negotiate their treaty. And that's what they've been doing. So, the treaty process brings up topics just as we do in our LOU under the RRSD, and they're working through creating agreements with things like parks, BC parks, federal parks, land back, hunting rights, and all of those things too. So I've had little glimpses of treaty components of their treaty, and they look pretty standard. I think that, we have a belief that, if other communities, are creating a way to be self-sustainable and self-governing, we're not going to step in and try and stop them from doing that. We do have I think there is a disagreement. I'm no longer with the Sartlet First Nation with the mining development across the way, that I think their referrals department and chief and council are working through right now. That has the problem to do with that self-sustainability. I'm not sure that they want to be doing that. I only have heard things through the grapevine, but, I think that they have some bills to pay. So, and there's not a lot of other opportunity.
There's a whole other conversation to be had about the BC treaty process. And, it's interesting about the story of Saanich. And the story of Saanich is, like, at a political level, the story of Saanich is we were the group that wasn't too keen on the fort being there in the first place, or the settlement. We're happy to trade, but, kind of move along, right? And then in the 60s and 70s with the American Indian movement, and with the beginning, we got like Philip Paul and a handful of others here with the manuals that started the Indian Brotherhood, and like Saanich was a part of that, part of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs. At the very beginning is Saanich, and they had those meetings in our community. And so, I think that I often tell this story from the Greens, was that, it's not the Saanich people, the meaning of the word Saanich is emerging people. And, not too odd to have a couple Greens elected here too, because we continue to emerge at that political level. But the Saanich, it's a pretty unique place. It's a pretty, in the context of the coast, so many of those nations are within that treaty process for years.
In 1913, one of our hunters was picked up by the province of BC and charged for hunting, or actually charged for carrying meat. He was carrying meat. So let's talk about like poverty and starvation. Meat confiscated, brought to court on it. And his defense was, I have a right to do this because I have a treaty. I have a Douglas Treaty in 1913. So this is not like there has been a continual advocacy. This is not like a new argument by any means. It's just you see it pick up in the 70s and 80s and 90s as sort of the legal picture starts changing, and you have a right to raise money to hire a lawyer. Like that was key. As soon as that happened, you saw land claims going all the way through. And then the treaty process comes up sort of, because the government gets inundated with land claims, because now we can hire lawyers. So as soon as we were able to do that as Indigenous people, it happened. And there's still this continual push all the way through. It wasn't like we were sitting back. It was that we were just so incredibly oppressed and starving that you couldn't fight it. And so,
So coming back to now, there's a question here about the role that municipal governments play. And I'm going to actually, Patricia, I'm just going to modify your question just a little bit here, because talking about going forward and float the idea of being able to generate revenue through the trade of real estate. Okay, so that's fine. Now there's a different relationship with municipalities. The question that Tricia has is around what role does municipal governments play in OCPs, but with the Saanich Nation with a reasonable amount of funds to be able to actually do the things that need to be done, have the conversations with local governments. What do those relationships look like to you in going forward at a community governance level?
So we created an MOU with the District of Saanich. That's the first one that we have. And in that MOU, it says that we'll work towards certain goals. And those certain goals are sort of grouped up. Most places don't like to go as far as land back. They say, they sort of back off. But things like one of the major pushes that we've had actually lately is archaeology. So that's a top of the list. So places are being developed and ground is being dug up, and our history is in museums and has been traded all across the world in museums. And often things are found and just not even, kept in somebody's living room. So there's a big push for cultural monitors to be on site with new developments, and the increase in sort of record keeping around archaeological finds. That's a big one that is within sort of that relationship. Another one is, often projects that go through municipalities don't have the duty to consult. So often it has to do with communication. So, let's create a new sort of relationship around how we're going to communicate with each other. Another one has to do with sort of access to things like parks and stuff. So we have lots of sports teams and really, really good athletes in our communities, and with that sort of have historically and still today have challenge accessing sort of field time or playing space. So access to sort of those types of spaces. Name changes are a big one. You looked at the map that I brought up. It's a completely different space when you feel different about a space. Different things about a space. If it has a name on it that has a meaning that describes the place and has a different history than Trutch Street, So it sort of replacing that sort of name. So that's another sort of thing with municipalities. And then watershed care. Watershed, where they're polluting, how they're polluting, and sort of how they're making decisions about polluting. Central Saanich, we've got Hagen Creek that goes down. When Adam was in the municipal government, there was this project between Keating Industrial Park and let's put in a what are they called? Catch basin or a retaining pond for the pollutants coming out of the industrial park before it gets down to the bay. And you come to tough decisions, that or a new tennis court, and you decide the tennis court. And so, hopefully in this day and age, with a little bit more advocacy from First Nations, the decision may go towards something like the retaining pond for pollutants that are coming down into the bay. So things maybe like that might be a bit of a change. And that's sort of what we are advocating for within municipalities, is some behavioral change around communications and decision making, but also things like park usage and watershed care.
Well, yeah, the provincial government just created a watershed fund, so hopefully the provincial government will be a part of funding those good projects and making sure that we do that. I got a question here about treaties, and here Joni described treaties as a way of extinguishing First Nations. Province now seems to be racing to conclude a number of treaties locally on Vancouver Island. How do you view the province's activities? And I've got something a little bit to say about this as well. But how do you see what's happening with treaties right now? You've mentioned, it is clear the treaty process today is a completely different process than the one that started. It's almost like First Nations waited out the provincial and the federal government to get rid of some of the worst parts of the treaty process. So
I don't know if we waited them out. we pressured, this was not just a waiting, well, maybe it was a waiting game. I heard quite a while ago that one of the
Okay,
strategies
both.
people had was that when you book a meeting time, you do it on late Friday afternoon, because we'll talk about it all weekend long and everybody else will want to get out of there. So let's make a decision quick. That was a negotiating.
Who was it? Who did that? Was it Art Manual? That was Art Manual, right?
Yeah. Oh man.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Oh, no, it wasn't. It was in Unsettling Canada, but it wasn't Art Manual. It was someone out east that did it, just to give credit to great tactic.
Yeah. So, yes, modern day treaties are changing. Not a lot of people in our communities actually know that, First Nations communities. Like if I was like, oh, we should go into this treaty process because there's all these great changes and it sort of resolves all the problems that you had, as if I were a leader and I did that, that's like talking about fee simple property for other leaders off reserve. There's no way. Like Saanich people have not wanted to talk about the modern day treaty process at all, but they have just very recently made some changes to the modern day treaty process that will hopefully encourage some of these First Nations that have been in this process to move through their process, or if they don't like it, still to back out. But I would say that a lot of the changes that they've made were from what they were hearing from First Nations. Like I had a presentation a couple of weeks ago. They do take into consideration, maybe not as far as I would go, but I'm like a big dreamer. Like I'm like over the edge this way, and I understand that. But it does take into consideration the major issues, especially with extinguishment. It no longer does that. Sort of their living relationships that are created. So.
All right. Well, that was we could go on for quite some time, and there's a whole bunch of other things to be said, like the record that the government has in honoring these treaties. There's a whole bunch more to talk about in this, but I think working with you and working towards finding a way to stand up and I think accomplish what it is that we've been asked to do, and that's to look after this beautiful place that we all live in. And our grandmother, she shared very clearly with me that it's the responsibility that we have to extend that responsibility to everybody that lives in Saanich, to be good stewards of it. And there was it's empowering actually, because you can actually be a part of this. You can be a voice. You can talk to your local government about how you expect them to interact with Saanich. You can talk to your MLA and demand better from them, and your MP, and require more from them. And you can be a positive steward of the environment and of the places that feed us. And those would all be living Saanich values. And that's invitation to everybody. Let's leave it at that. Tex, I see you.
Thank you, Joni. Thank you, Adam. Joni, that was spectacular. And please, maybe we can have you back in a year and get an update on what's going on, because we are all looking for change. So thank you for sharing. And thank you for
Yeah, that was awesome.
Giving us insight into the world you live in and another view. Please join me this evening in thanking Joni. And also, Joni has named, for those of you who would like to make a contribution on behalf of this evening, Joni has named the food bank, the Saanich Peninsula Food Bank, which is part of the Lions Group, supported by the Lions. Perhaps you might make a donation to the food bank, help out on food security, as Joni mentioned. And just to let you know that we have upcoming Voices of Saanich that we're working on. I haven't got a hard date yet, but I have been talking with Martin Wales at SIMRAIS, which is Saturna Island Research and Education Society. Marine Education Society. They do lots of work with the orcas, and Martin is going to join us. We just didn't have an opportunity to pin down a date, but we'll have that for everyone shortly.
And if
And
you like whales and you want to see them, you should head out to this cool little island out Saturna. Yeah.
isn't that the truth, eh?
Yeah.
We had some guests who were staying at the lodge yesterday. They bought a lot out at East Point, and they're doing a little bit of work on their piece of land. And they said, and the whales went by in the afternoon when we were out having a break. And yes, that's where you're going to see the whales.
One of the other families that we've got stories about and the importance that they have for us.
Yeah, thank you. You've helped us, Adam and Joni, to understand more about that world. So 1, make a contribution. 2, thank you for joining us. 3, we have more coming later and we'll keep you posted. And 4, once again, Joni, thank you so much for giving of yourself this evening to share your thoughts and ideas and history with us.
Yeah, thank you, Joni. That was really good. I really appreciated the conversation and really appreciated your presentation. Thank you.
So everyone, have a great evening. Thank you and good night. Nicely done. Thank you,
Yeah.
John.
Yeah, it was good.